My name is Augusta DeLomo. I'm here with my colleague Brian Franklin. Today is October 28th, 2023. We are in New York City and we are interviewing Doug Little. And Doug, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I am, in fact, Doug Little. I can attest to that. And I am a Middle Westerner by birth, and I went to Cornell for graduate school in 1972, 51 years ago, hard as that is to believe. And I went there because I was desirous of studying with Walt LaFeber. I had been an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin. I was born in Nebraska, went to grade school in Iowa, went to high school just outside Minneapolis, and then on to the University of Wisconsin, where I worked with one of Walt's closest friends, Tom McCormick, who was a professor there. And I got the history bug, wanted to go on and get a PhD, and had been exposed to Walt's work as an undergraduate and headed off to, as we say in the Midwest, out east. So that's my story, and I stand by it.
What was your first meeting with Walt LaFeber? Do you remember it?
Oh, I do. He had an office on the fourth floor of McGraw Hall, and I was a freshly minted undergraduate, and Wisconsin is a much, much bigger place than Cornell, so I had a good relationship with Tom McCormick, but there wasn't the kind of intense connection between undergraduates and the professor that I discovered at Cornell when I arrived outside his office door and discovered that there was a queue, there was a line. There were probably 10 other people waiting to see him, almost all of them undergraduates, and Walt was very gracious. I must have got in to see him probably about, he started his office hours at 3:30, so I must have got in to see him maybe 5:15 or 5:30, still going strong. And Walt was, I was too, having survived the ordeal there in the hallway. And we had a great conversation basically about both being Middle Westerners, because he was from Indiana and had grown up in northern Indiana, and he was a ferocious fan of the Chicago Cubs, and I was a ferocious fan of the Minnesota Twins, so we bonded over baseball. I guess I could sort of forgive him for being a fan of the Fighting Irish at Notre Dame, which farther west in the Midwest, Notre Dame was not quite as central to the experience as it was in Indiana. But it was as I said in the piece that we've done for the tribute volume, he was just so extraordinarily approachable. I mean, he really put you at ease. He wasn't a stuffed shirt, he wasn't condescending, he wasn't patronizing, he was just a Middle Western good guy. And he put me at ease. One of my concerns was I'd been out east once by the time I was 22 years old. My senior high school group went to New York City and Washington, D.C. at the worst possible moment, which was the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. So I didn't get to see much of Washington, but did get to see much of New York City. And I didn't know Ithaca from Fargo or anything like that. And I was assuming it was sort of going to be this metropolitan area. That's how naive I was. And of course, it's a nice small town, and I sort of expressed my concern that this was my second venture out east. And he said, well, not to worry about that, that the people, especially in Ithaca, were quite a friendly bunch, and that although Middle Westerners had certain stereotypes about the East, as Walt did, they weren't all true. So I really feel that I'm not sure I could have survived the 6 years of graduate school just being so far from family and in such a foreign terrain if he hadn't been there assuring me that he had done the same thing and that it was a good place to be.
Can you talk about him a little bit more as an advisor, memorable moments, and what that relationship was like both intellectually and personally?
Yeah. Well, I think the funniest memory about him as an advisor and a mentor came after I'd actually gotten my PhD, and I'd gone off to Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts to teach. And I was coming up for tenure just at the moment I was finishing off the revised version of my dissertation, which for almost all historians is what becomes their first book. It was a book on the U.S. and the Spanish Civil War. And I did what all folks who were putting their first book together do, which was to do a survey of the literature. And in the literature, in the introduction, in the survey of the literature at the beginning of my manuscript that I was going to submit to get it published, it was ultimately published by Cornell. I had begun to trot out the sins of the previous people who had tried to deal with the U.S. decision not to aid the Spanish Republic during the 1930s. And I cited chapter and verse, and I had several people who I'd mentioned who didn't quite get it the way I did, and who I was right, they were wrong. Not quite that blunt, but that was the message. The last of whom was this guy, Richard Traina, who had written a book on the United States and the Spanish Civil War, and I was especially acute in my criticism of him. So as we all did this. We sent it off to Walt to let him see what he thought. And he sent back this very nice letter saying, "You've done a nice job revising the manuscript. As for the introduction, you might want to think about moving these folks to the footnotes, or perhaps taking them out of the introduction altogether, because after all, these are the people who will be reviewing your book." So I can't remember exactly what I did. I think I moved them to the footnotes. And then at that point, Clark was just hiring a new president. And the new president became Richard Traina. And so I got to send Walt a, "You're the best advisor imaginable" thing, because I said, it's not that they might be, reviewing your book, it's that they might become president of the university. But it's testament to his commitment to his students, and his commitment to their success, and his gentle way of nudging you in a direction that was going to be advantageous for your career. But as a graduate student, I always, he never meant to make you feel that he was busy, but I was always very aware that it wasn't, unless he was in a schmoozing mood to talk about the Cubs or the Twins, that the meter was running, in part because there was a line outside his office door. But as I look back on it, he still managed to take the time to kind of address your concerns and give you, some good advice. The graduate program at Cornell in the 1970s, like a lot of other places that aren't Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, was small. I mean, there was the cohort when I came in, there was one other person who came in who was going to study with Walt. And I think the sum total of Americanists in 1972 who came into the PhD program, I want to say was something like 6 or 7. So there really wasn't that cohort of students that at a bigger place, at a bigger state place like Wisconsin, you'd have a cohort of 15 or 20 students. But he went out of his way to kind of bring, as Susan Brewer put it, to bring the strays together to kind of create a sense of community. So he'd have an informal reading group and all of that. He was very demanding in terms of what he had you do. His way of assigning books in this graduate reading group or small seminar that we had, the topic would be, say, the 1890s, the New Empire or something like that. And he'd say, "Well, do you know Bob Eisner's book? Do you know Tom McCormick's book? Do you know the biography of Seward?" And you end up with these 5 books, and you think, "Okay, well, come back next week with a short paper and tell me about those books." And it took me about 6 weeks to discover that, or to understand that when he said, "Do you know this book?" it didn't mean you had to read it, because, life is short. But it meant you had to figure out what was in it and read the reviews, and if it was a really good book, you'd read it. So he was quite demanding in that way. And as we say in our introduction to the tribute volume, he could not abide sloppy writing. And it really is true. Richard Immerman and I were talking about this. It really is true that for me, 51 years after I met Walt, and Rich, it's 55 years. Anytime we think about splitting an infinitive, anytime we think about ending a sentence with a preposition, we better have a damn good reason to do it, because somewhere, there's disapproval raining down on us for doing that. So he's had high standards, I guess is what I'm saying. He was a Middle Westerner, so he was a very private person, somewhat aloof. I don't think as a graduate student I got to know him as a person very well. I was at his house a couple of times during my time as a graduate student, and he was always very, friendly and warm, but just a little bit of distance between you and him, which I think is probably what you have to be when you're a graduate mentor, but also, speaking as a Middle Westerner, I think there's that kind of aloofness as well. But, you look back on your career after retiring. Now, I retired this past June, and you think back, like, how could it possibly be 51 years ago when I first met him? And you look back when you go through the graduate school, it's a grind, and you spend a lot of time in the library, and it doesn't seem like the best years of your life, but in a lot of ways, it was, because you had good friends and you had a good mentor, and you got to read a lot of books and think about ideas and not worry about the lecture for the next week or getting tenure or anything like that. So, but he was a great advisor, and I think everybody who you're going to be interviewing will tell you the same thing about him. And he was remarkable, as Jeff Engel says, in his comment. How did he, as a professor now, how the hell did he find time to do all this with his students and to develop the relationships and then publish these magnificent books? So, yeah.
While he was advising you, were there consistent intellectual questions that he wanted you to think about and return to, themes or books, or consistent pieces of advice that you saw throughout your graduate career with him of those were his points of emphasis, those were the things he wanted you to think about, and on your own, not as him dictating to you what to think, but what he wanted you to think about?
Well, the first thing I guess to note, and everybody will tell you this, is that you got to pick your own dissertation topic. There are programs, I won't name them, Princeton, no, where you don't necessarily get to pick your own topic. So whatever you were excited about, he was excited about as well. And then once you settled on a topic, he made it clear to you that you needed to master the secondary literature, and that you needed to, we just talked about the new empire downstairs, that you needed to be thinking about the intellectual, the strategic, and the economic formulation behind the policy, whatever it was you were looking at. I was looking at the US and Spain in the 1930s. And so, from an ideological or intellectual standpoint, why did Spain matter? From an economic standpoint, were there American investments in Spain? There were. And then the strategic dimension, well, it's the eve of the Second World War. You've got the neutrality laws that are in play and all of that. So, and I suspect if you didn't know that coming in, and I knew a little bit about that because I'd worked with Tom McCormick at Wisconsin, he might have nudged you in that direction, but it wasn't a diktat. It was just, these are three ways that you might want to consider approaching a problem. And then after I completed my work and went off to teach, and then worked on my second book on the U.S. and the Middle East, I began to bring popular culture into it, which was not something that came up during the 1970s. But he was quite open to that. He was a movie fan, and kept up with popular culture and all of that. And so we could talk about various books that sort of orientalized the Middle Eastern peoples, and he thought that was a reasonable way to approach it. But it wasn't something that he forced me to do. But once I said, does this make sense as I move on to this next project? He said, well, of course. So, which I think explains his own eclectic approach later in his career to how he handled U.S. foreign relations. I don't know if you're familiar with the book on Michael Jordan and global capitalism, but that kind of all took all of our breath away, in part because it was about basketball rather than baseball, but and just the way he was able to use sort of this popular culture icon as almost, we didn't have the word meme back then, but it was a meme for what neoliberal globalization was like in the 1990s. So the short answer to your question is he kind of nudged you in a particular direction, maybe if you hadn't thought of it, but if you'd already thought of it, he was quite happy with that and open to different approaches.
After you finish up at Cornell and you head to Clark and start your career, I'm curious how you've interacted with Walt's work over the years, whether it's research or writing or the way that you saw yourself as a teacher. We've heard so much about him as an instructor. What things that you continue to go back to and engage with from him?
Well, on the teaching front, the thing that's remarkable about him is that for him, teaching and teaching undergraduates in particular well was what it was all about. And all of us, I'm sure as you've interviewed these folks, all of us aspired to do what Walt did, which was to emulate his mentor, Fred Harvey Harrington, and lecture before, well, at Clark it would have been 75 or 100 students. At Cornell it was 400, at Wisconsin it was probably 600, without notes. And none of us could ever do that. And we knew from our experience, I think the undergraduates knew as well, that Walt was always upstairs in his faculty study on the 5th floor of Olin Library before lecture, getting ready for lecture. And it was, he it wasn't that he memorized everything, but he went over it, and then he just, in a matter-of-fact way, was able to deliver the lecture. And I was talking to Richard Immerman about this. I mean, neither of us could do that for two reasons. We needed the lecture notes as a safety net. But more importantly, we would digress. And Richard, the same way, tell what we think is a good joke. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And you just killed 3 minutes. How are you ever going to finish on the spot 50 minutes, 49 minutes, 45 seconds? Now, what can we say in conclusion? So I think we all aspired to that style. I think we all have, not to pat ourselves on the back, but I think we're all pretty good undergraduate teachers because he taught us that that's what this is all about. We just were downstairs talking about the New Empire, and Susan Brewer and Bob Hannigan were talking about Walt's experience as an undergraduate at Hanover College, where he had a mentor who sounds very much like Walt in terms of a guy named Robert Bowers, who kind of developed an intense commitment to teaching undergraduates, and in a small college like Hanover, that would be normal. At a big research university like Wisconsin, not so normal. At a research university like Cornell, probably not so normal. So we all aspire to do those things as teachers. As researchers, I mean, he was someone who was always pushing you to check out newly opened archives. He was a chair of the State Department Historical Advisory Commission in the 1970s and did his best to speed up the process of declassification. So he always encouraged us to file FOIAs and mandatory reviews, and yet you look at his own work, and it wasn't, the later work wasn't necessarily document heavy. He relied a lot on op-eds, policymakers were writing about Central America or whatever. He'd gone back to the archives as well, but he always pushed us hard, I think, to kind of pick topics that where there was new evidence emerging. We always felt, I think, that he had some supernatural power to anticipate what the next big thing would be. So the Panama Canal book, I was still in graduate school when he was working on that, and he finished the America-Russia and Cold War book in the second edition of that. And he was very secretive, I guess I would say, about what he was working on, but it became clear by about 1974, 75 that this is what he was working on, the Panama Canal. And I, of course, was a graduate student. I would never say this to him, but in 74, 75, I'm thinking, Panama Canal? Really? What? And then doesn't the treaty become an issue, or the treaties become an issue for Jimmy Carter, and the book came out at just the right moment. And then Inevitable Revolutions, same thing. There it wasn't such a surprise. We knew what was going on in Central America. And he put together that book and became kind of a lightning rod on, I guess I would say, the center left. He never really considered himself to be a lefty, but center left, people who were supportive of the Reagan administration's policies in Central America made him kind of a target because of what he had to say. So, but he was always, and then I think he says in the introduction to the book, The Clash on the U.S. and Japan, he says that his publisher Norton, the Japan that's #1 and all that becomes a really big issue in the late 80s and early 90s. Who won the Cold War? The Japanese did. His publisher said, no, you should be thinking about Japan. And sure enough, the next big book comes out on Japan. Michael Jordan, I can't explain. I think that's the love of basketball. And he was a basketball player himself in college. So, but yeah, we all, as I wrote on, there was a little celebration for Walt's 60th birthday in 1993. And my comment in the little memory book or whatever was, I said, like he's a basketball fan. Larry Bird was number 33 for the Celtics. So I said, kids in Massachusetts grow up wanting to be just like number 33. We want to be just like you. So, and we tried, and I think you always had a sense that he was out there kind of in your corner, but also kind of watching what you were doing. So anyway, yeah, it was an inspiration for all of us.
I think one of the things that's most striking about Walt's career is how many different things he wrote on, how many different kinds of questions across time, geographies. What do you think, if you were going to put it, the threads that tie his his disparate intellectual productions together.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think drove him? What were the questions that sat underneath all of these different works?
Well, I mean, I think he was very interested in getting inside the heads of the policymakers, trying to understand what made them tick. And so, if you look at the first book, The New Empire, you've got Alfred Thayer Mahan, you've got William Seward, you've got Josiah Strong, you've got all these public intellectuals and policymakers who are making decisions about what's going to happen with American foreign policy in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the question is, try to get inside their heads what made them tick, because if you could understand what made them tick, what their economic values were, where they came from, what sort of moral philosophy they might have, you could better understand why they made the decisions they did. And then you jump to the America, Russia, and the Cold War book, and again he probes the minds of George Kennan and Dean Acheson and that crew, and tries to understand what they were concerned about. And he would often he was somebody who didn't believe that history repeated itself, but he always talked about lessons of the past. I said in the little introduction piece to the tribute, his office was an interesting place. I had the good fortune to visit as a visitor at Cornell in 88, 89, and I got to use his office because he was away in the UK doing sabbatical work. And on the back, I knew this from when I was a TA for him, on the back of his office door, there were two things. There was this color ad of this household cleaner called Big Wally, which was there. And the joke was, inside the history department at that point, there was Walter LaFeber, who did American Diplomatic, and there was Walter Pinter, who did Russia. And the graduate students, there was Big Wally and there was Little Wally. So there was that, but there was also this handwritten thing bowdlerizing the famous comment by Santayana, "Those who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it." And Walter, his handwritten version said, "And those who do know the past are doomed to repeat it anyway." And so he was always big on lessons of the past and the influence of past successes and mistakes on the making of policy. So his lecture on the origins of the Cold War, which I'm proud to say I shamelessly stole and appropriated from my own course, talked about the ghost of aggression past and the ghost of depression past, and how those ghosts haunted the policymakers in the 1940s and 1950s. So he was always interested in people, and then he was always interested in sort of systems, so that especially with regard to his first love, I think, was Latin America. That's his dissertation and his first book was on the U.S. foreign policy in the Caribbean and Venezuela and all of that, and then it became the New Empire. And so how the system fits together. So there's the people who are making policy, and then there's this system. And it was he wasn't a reductionist in terms of capitalism or anything like that, but it was an intellectual system, an economic system. How does it work? How does it transform? Part of what he does in his later books in the 90s with globalization is how we go from a kind of an American heavy system to a neoliberal system where there are multiple centers of economic power. So I think that's the thread. It's almost a methodological thread. Topically, who would have guessed, the 1890s, the Cold War, Central America, Japan, basketball, and then back to 1968 in his book, The Deadly Bet. So topically, it was seemed kind of eclectic, but if you look at people and if you look at systems, which he did, he was, I think, had an abiding concern for the safety and the health of the American system. And he was big on Alex de Tocqueville and all of that. So, but it is curious. I mean, there aren't many historians, I think, who got that range. I mean, most of us don't publish 7 or 8 books, so there's that. But most of us who go off and do research, for me, it's a deep dive, deeper and deeper and deeper into the Middle East. One area, you sort of feel like you master it, and for him, it was more eclectic, and that's what I think made it such an interesting person to work with.
How do you think he would describe his contribution to the field of U.S. foreign relations, and do you think it's different than how you would describe it?
Well, he was, again, a Middle Westerner, so he was unassuming, and he didn't, he wasn't a self-promoter, and so I think he would recoil at the idea of, I influenced the field. But on the other hand, I think what he would say is what he was really good at. He wasn't a fire eater. He wasn't a provocateur, but he was willing to ask questions that others maybe weren't, and he did it in such a civil way that it was possible to have kind of a civil discourse. He didn't have sharp elbows, and he wasn't looking to pick a fight. He was willing to listen to another argument. And I think at a time in the 1950s when he was in graduate school, and we had Joe McCarthy, the equivalent of all the Republicans today in 2024 in Wisconsin, there were people at Wisconsin, at the university, Bill Williams being one of them, who was kind of maybe eager to pick a fight or willing to duke it out. And Walt was trying to find a way to have the conversation about controversial issues, whether it was the Cold War, or whether it was the Spanish-American War, or whether it was the Vietnam War, to have that kind of conversation in a non-confrontational way. One of the, there was a huge flurry of email when Walt passed away in March of 2021, and email came in from a bunch of people just remembering Walt for the great soul that he was. And the one that I remember best along these lines is from Tom Patterson, who's a very distinguished American diplomatic historian who taught many years at Connecticut, retired, and is the editor of Major Problems in American Foreign Policy, sort of the definitive reader. Anyway, so Tom was recalling a conference that he went to where Walt was the chair, and Tom was on the panel, and Tom was commenting on a paper by, I can't remember, these two brothers. They were Middle Western congressional historians, and they'd written a biography, as I recall. I can't remember which the senator was, but they went out of their way, after Tom Patterson made some criticism, to attack Tom as a communist, basically. This is like 1979, 1980. Patterson's recalling this. So Patterson, Tom has a feisty streak. So Walt could see Tom sort of tensing up, like he was not maybe going to dive over the table at them, but say something. And Tom says, Walt reached over and he put his hand on my hand and said, "It's best not to respond." And so that was, that was his contribution. And I think because he had some controversial things to say, but he said them in a civil way, and he said them not in an arrogant way, and not in a self-promoting way, he was able to start that conversation. And as we've all said, looking as we put the tribute together, so many of his books have become the master narrative, from our standpoint anyway. On the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis would probably disagree, but we all know that Walt had the story right. In the 1890s, ditto. Central America, ditto. Japan, well, there was a funny comment about the book The Clash. Walt emailed David Langbart, who's one of the people who's in the Tribune book, and as the Clash was coming to press and it was dragging on, and Walt said, I apologize for the book. The book is 500 pages or 450 pages of text long. I don't know what happened. Normally I've got better control than this. So none of us, I guess, would say it may be the master narrative, but it's a really long and thick master narrative. So I think that was the secret, was being who he was, which is being a civil guy, open to other ideas, believing in kind of the academic enterprise, thinking, not to be too corny, but thinking otherwise, thinking differently about how others have approached a particular problem, and presenting it in a way that's not argumentative, but is open to conversation. I think that made him very, very effective as a scholar and a researcher. And he had very, very few, he had, I can only think of one time that he had an unkind thing to say about Samuel Eliot Morrison making an attack on Charles Beard. But I also remember, I was going to mention it downstairs, in 1978, the American Historical Review, I think, commissioned a 15th anniversary review article on the New Empire. Actually, it was on the 1890s, but it was written by this guy, James Field, who was a military historian of late 19th century America, naval historian. And Field had titled his article, American Expansion in the 1890s, the worst chapter in any book. And he, what's the polite way to say it? He tore into Walt and his anatomy in ways that were not appropriate, and basically made his case that this was a book. And his peroration was to say that Walt had left many, many people out of this book that would have refuted his thesis about American expansionism, including James Scrimser, the father of the Trans-Pacific Cable. So Walt writes his response, very measured, very civil, and he gets to the point where he's talking about Scrimser being missing in action. And Walt writes something like, it is true that I left James Scrimser out of my book. In fact, I left other people who were more important than James Scrimser out of my book as well. Sometimes I fear they may number in the tens. And it was just, that sort of witty, kind of dry humor that basically telegraphs to the reviewer, well, what's the matter with you? And he did it in just an elegant way and in a civil way, rather than the way I might have done it, which would have been to take the gloves off and just pound away. So he was a good guy.
If you could have Walt write one more book, what do you think he would have written about, and what question would you have wanted his take on in book form that you didn't get?
Well, he was always a big picture guy, and I know from I didn't have a lot of contact with him in his last few years. I know he was deeply troubled by the direction that the country was headed, even before Trump was elected in 2016. Even though his forte was history of international relations, history of American foreign policy, I think a political history book or a monograph trying to make sense of the xenophobia and the nativism and the isolationism that has sort of taken over the center right or the far right in the United States. When Trump was running in 2016, I was teasing him about Trump and what was likely to happen, and I said I hoped that Trump wouldn't win, but I feared in my heart of hearts that he might. And Walt wrote back an email saying, well, if that happens, you'll be hearing from me from someplace in the Pacific, Tahiti, because it won't be worth the candle. So then Trump gets elected, so I send him an email saying, well, when are you leaving for Tahiti? And he said, well, that might not be a bad option. So I know he was thinking about those questions, as we all have been, but he would have, I think, approached it in a very systematic way, and he would have, again, tried to focus, maybe not trying to get inside Trump's head, who wants to do that, but the minds of the policymakers and the political leaders, and what they were not seeing about what they were doing to the American experiment. Or more specifically, maybe the political consultants. I mean, we never talked to him about that, but the political consultants who've kind of taken over American politics and branding a particular politician, Ted Cruz, or what message you want to get out there, whether you believe it or not, and how there's a disconnect between that and maybe what's good for the republic. So I would have liked to see him do something on that.
Is there anything else that you want viewers of this to know about Walt as we wrap up?
Well, no. I mean, he was just, one heck of a good guy. I mean, he really, he when you asked him to come to your university to give a talk, he always said yes. When you needed a letter of recommendation, it was always yes. When you had a chapter or two or an entire manuscript that you wanted him to look at, the answer was always yes. and you'd get back these detailed, with the request to look at a manuscript, very detailed, single-spaced, 2- and 3-page letters, and then ultimately 2- or 3-page emails. And it raised for all of us the question of where does he find the time to do this? But I think he was so committed to the academic enterprise and so committed to his students. I mean, it wasn't a paternalistic kind of interest. It was a genuine interest in his students as human beings, and he was excited about the work we were doing and was pleased to be as helpful as he could. And in academic life, you don't always find mentors or just people out there who've got that same kind of temperament. And in that sense, it wasn't surprising to any of us that he kind of emerged as a leader of the Cornell History Department. He was there when there were some very hard times over the Strait takeover in 1969 and all of that. But everybody, it was apparent to us in graduate school that Joel Silby and Michael Kamen, Richard Polenberg, and the whole Americanist crew, not to mention some of the Europeanists, really looked up to Walt as a role model and as their leader. And I think he did that in a very quiet way, and yet he never wanted anything to do with administration. I mean, he had great jokes about administration. The joke that we've included in the introduction is when Dale Corson, his favorite president, came to him and asked him to be dean of the college. Walt said no. And Walt had said at the time of the Strait takeover, because of Corson's brilliant performance in putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, that he would do just about anything for Dale Corson, including carry out the garbage. And so Corson says, someone told me you'd carry out the garbage for me. And Walt said, I'll do that, but I won't be dean. So yeah, he did it he was just a spectacular human being. I guess that's the takeaway message. And all of us feel that way. And we feel so lucky to have been able to work with him and tried to carry on in our own way, try to carry on his style of teaching and doing research.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.